Give a word to our presenters. And first one will be Noah Krasman. He is a researcher and a writer and graduate of the Vice Levant International MA program in Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa. His academic interests include Holocaust memory, critical theory, and anti-Semitism. Noah was an assistant researcher in the international project, which is called Sites of Tension, Shifts in Holocaust Memory, Anti-Semitism, and Political Contextualization in Europe, which focused on contemporary anti-Semitism and Holocaust memory discourse in the UK and in Europe. In May 2023, he published an article in the Journal of Genocide Research, and I assume that this will be a part of your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you and good afternoon. Thank you for your perseverance into this final panel. I'm really honored to be here amongst you all. And to present, yep, that's it. Yes, to be, as you can see, I have just a few slides, so please get used to my voice. I will focus on Soviet, Russian Holocaust memory, the political currency of state memory, originating during the siege and continuing today in the language of genocide. Which we have seen has become largely diluted, though we focus very much on it. And as has been discussed, a very demanding term, so this is why we're here. What I will present is codified in Russian law, and what can be also be referred to as quasi-legal. I also wish to extend my gratitude to a dear friend and colleague of mine who helped with the Russian translation, but who wishes to remain anonymous. So, what occurred between September 1941 and January 44 in the siege of Leningrad may be one of the most tragic losses of civilian life in modern warfare. As Felix noted yesterday at the start, genocide often finds a home within military history or in the depths of war. And what we have heard today thus far calls attention to the present moment as well. And as historians, we are forced to reckon with history as it unfolds, even as we speak. So, what inspired me to write the article was in October 2022, excuse me, in October 2022, yeah, thank you. St. Petersburg court decision, which I will let you read here, in which Judge Vera Sadnikova claimed the following. The spirit of this declaration, as you can see, containing many classifications of the siege, in addition to being a genocide, raises important questions, not only about genocide recognition as a political act, but also about the exploitation of historical narratives in the wars of aggression. Russian state memory, which is undecided between victory and victimhood, informs the writing and rewriting of its history as set forth in legal bodies, civic doctrine, and even in war itself. It also raises central issues in current debates about genocide status as the crime of crimes, and Holocaust memory as an international currency of state legitimacy. Despite Russia's declared war aim to denazify Ukraine, coupled with its somewhat recent embrace of Holocaust memory, the recognition of the siege seems to follow, as genocide seems to follow the generic concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity. Previously, Russia had monumentalized the siege as the culmination of Germany's main crime, which was the attack on peaceful Soviet citizens. And consequently, Russia has an ambivalent relationship to Holocaust memory due to its universalist, anti-fascist commitment to a national memory of civilian suffering in World War II. However, in the current war, understanding itself as at once as a victim of genocide and the guardian of authentic anti-fascist Holocaust memory is a convenient position, Unlike some contemporary scholarship, which abandons the conceptual stretching of genocide in favor of new concepts, Russian authorities combined their independent monumentalization of the siege with the monumental category of genocide as the crime of crimes. And so, in doing, they perversely and rhetorically underpin Russia's commission of international crimes against Ukrainians in the name of preventing them. Now, this declaration also raises questions about its motivations, which is part of the reason we're here. Though by now they seem to be laid bare, at least in this room. So how does Russian political memory incorporate the Holocaust specifically? I will, because we will discuss further into this. How does it incorporate the Holocaust into its modern identity, and how does its special treatment of Soviet victory and victimhood inform its role as a defender then and as an offender today? So let us first consider the theoretical, as I referred to earlier, what the Russian lawyer Konstantin Dobrinin calls the quasi-legislative aspect. Declarations do set precedents, as this has, though it is not a court decision that can be formally challenged on any ground. I'm not aware of any punishments derived from this decision, though I would like to know, though it could influence legislators to adapt the claim into an amendment in federal law to include protections of siege memory, which as it does already for the memory of Soviet soldiers and leadership during the Great Patriotic War. At the very least, the rhetorical inclusion of genocide is performative and aligns Russia with a shared but morally ambivalent awareness of genocide and fascism and Nazism, which the rest of the world can point to and say, look, Russia is fighting against the threat of fascism, but this is not the point. It is a retroactive fight against its own narrative and its insecurity within these narratives. Speaking of security, Russia's opposition to foreign intervention is strategically alluded to in the inclusion of the various nationalities other than Germany in the statement. In March 2022, soon after the special military operation commenced, Putin commented on the alleged use of human shields in Ukraine by, quote, foreign mercenaries. Acts of genocide recognition combined with the accusation of foreign meddling in Russian affairs highlights the state's insistence on securing security itself. And this is what Dirk Moses refers to as permanent security, whereby state actors determine real or perceived threats as undermining present and future state objectives, which then serve to justify the often violent means manifested in these agendas. The strategy derived from the insecurity of being undermined is oblivious to its own irony, as it evidently and perpetually obstructs its own humanity seeking by the violence by which it is often accompanied. Back to the siege. Its siege memory has its roots in Leningrad during the siege. According to Lisa Kirschenbaum, the quote, epic terms in which the state media would narrate the siege were set quite early in reference to August 1941 broadcasts appealing to citizens and becoming, quote, heroic defenders on the, quote, state front. Contemporary identity formation in Russia is deeply rooted in its origins in World War II and the Great Fatherland War, after which both the, quote, Soviet and Allied press transformed besieged Leningrad into legend, a compelling story of steadfastness and heroism. That survivors and authorities from Leningrad have both assumed a mythopoetic role of heroism suggests something about the way they process their grief and how state leaders seek to sanitize, co-opt, and contain memory, end quote. Nevertheless, speaking of state leaders, the Nazis' intentions in the East are quite clear. Devastation, starvation, the making of a nation of peasants, the Holocaust by bullets, war of attrition, a blitzkrieg in the slow eastern winters. But the court decision was not the first to conceive the siege as an act of genocide. In the last decade, some historians have formally proposed the genocidal nature or dimension of the siege, and this perspective has stirred a broader ideological activation within Russian academia, media, and government. This inclusion or otherwise related terminology in the historiography of the siege is relatively new, given Finland's involvement in the siege, for instance, albeit far more passive in proportion. Scholars suggested in 2011 that since the 1960s, quote, only a few Finnish and international historians assign Finland a share of the blame for the genocide in Leningrad. Their contention is that while, quote, the mass extermination of the Jews was widely publicized as genocide, the siege of Leningrad, which met all the conditions to be considered genocide, was hardly publicized. So pointing to the categorical pedestal on which the Holocaust is and has been placed, these scholars question the extent to which discourse and literature dedicated to the siege is consistent with historical interest in other genocidal events. In the 2012 documentary history by Nikita Lomagin and Richard Bidlack, they write, next to the Holocaust, the Leningrad siege was the greatest act of genocide in Europe during the Second World War. As many scholars have written, genocide has been historically construed as the crime of crimes, just as Jewish Holocaust victims are perceived as exemplary victims. The siege of Leningrad as genocide is actually rather reasonable, but it is weaponized when it becomes an exemplary crime to act on in the future. I can't recall who mentioned him yesterday, but in his 2020 publication about the concurrence of the siege and the Holocaust, Alexander Dukov, director of the Historical Memory Foundation and a scholar at the Institute of History, the Russian Academy of Science, does just this, and in the form of an instructional and pedagogical module for educators. So it marks an entrance of the innovative discourse, placing these two in parallel, treating them as separate events but possibly overlapping. And here we are reminded of Raphael Lemkin's assertion that Jews and Slavs faced genocide during World War II. To the credit of Dukov, the threat of Jewish genocide nearly reached Leningrad around the time the German army began the siege. Yitzhak Arad outlines the evidence of Einsatzgruppen active in the Leningrad region whose intentions were to reach the city limits. In particular, Einsatzgruppe A stationed their headquarters in Krasnovardisk in October 1941, nearly 40 kilometers south of the city. Concentrated in the area of Army Group North, quote, its final objective was Leningrad. But while there's no reason to believe their objective was reached, Arad specifies the activity of the murder squads leading up to the 17th of September capture of Pushkin, just a few kilometers south of Leningrad, where the town's 250 Jews were murdered in the town's palace and buried in its gardens. Leningrad had been sealed off on the 8th of that month, and the Nazis' first extermination camp in Chelmno would commence operations in December. In 2008, the German government recognized around 6,000 Jewish survivors of the siege and granted them a one-time reparation payment. Notably, former residents of Leningrad and awardees for its defense during the siege were also granted payments by the Russian government in 2021. Signifying its place in genocide discourse, Dukov labels both tragedies as crimes against humanity, and for good measure he adds that, quote, the blockade of Leningrad is as much a crime against humanity as the Holocaust, and that, quote, the city was in fact turned into a gigantic ghetto, starving to death. And so, though chronological, ideological, and methodological parallels are identifiable between the siege and the onset of concentrated extermination, there are still major barriers for historians whose non-inclusive representational archetype of genocide is the Holocaust. In this way, the court decision is demonstrating the dilemma of victimhood competition, we might say, and while Dukov's analogy to the ghetto is a challenging one, it raises important questions. In her 2017 portrait of aesthetic responses, Polina Barskova offers a set of inquiries which I will let you read. And so we have a visual representation that is more recognizable as a camp or ghetto. As ordered from above, German soldiers became guards of an urban encampment. Alex K. writes of the Wehrmacht, their, quote, military campaign in the East cannot therefore be diffused from the parallel war of annihilation, while at the same time Nazi racial policy cannot be seen as distinct from the strategic context of the war, especially in the summer of 1941. Holocaust memory has since been described as an instrument of soft power used by Russian officials, manifesting from Russia's posturing as allied liberator, not only to Soviet Jews, but also to the Jews as a nationality. And that will go beyond my time, but I will say that marking the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz, Holocaust Remembrance Day used to be observed at the same time as the day of the lifting of the siege of Leningrad on the 27th of January. However, the Russian Ministry of Education removed Holocaust Remembrance Day from the school calendar in November 21. Upon questioning, the ministry explained there was already a similar date, the day of commemoration of the genocide of the Soviet people on the 19th of April. While the government reinstated the memorial date in 2022, the ministry's explanation reveals the conflation or substitution of the genocide of Soviet Jews with that of the monolithic Soviet peoples. Despite initial withdrawal in 2023, Russia dedicated a week of memorial events to 27th of January when World War II veterans, Israeli parliament members, and Russian diplomats came together at the monument to the siege of Leningrad and Jerusalem to memorialize the Soviet losses to Nazi Germany, as well as Soviet Jews who perished in the Holocaust, during which the Russian ambassador to Israel, Anatoly Viktorov, venerated the country's joint efforts in combating anti-Semitism and historical revisionism of Nazi crimes. They, quote, "do not have a statute of limitations and should not be forgotten." This stance positions Russia as the authentic protector of genocide memory and the liberator of fascist entities to come. In 2012, as Anton Weisvent notes, the Russian delegation to the UN first coupled Ukraine and the Holocaust in a statement condemning Ukraine's vote against UN Resolution 67-154, sponsored by Russia, which summarily condemned the, quote, glorification of Nazism. Similarly, while visiting Moscow's Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in 2015, Putin urged his audience to resist the, quote, violent nationalism of the Ukrainian and Baltic kind, which is based on the exact same ideology that made the Holocaust possible. To be sure, genocide definition in Soviet and modern Russia is particularly complex, and I unfortunately don't have time to go into that, but since the term has not been familiarized there, more so in the West than in Russia, on account of what Michel Penn refers to as the, quote, Soviet Union's relative estrangement from international law. So this is the context then for Putin's conceptualization of Ukraine as a fascist entity, permitting Russia to intervene in response to what has been deemed a false claim of genocide against Russians in Ukraine. Here, genocide is inherently fascist and the reverse applies. To conclude, the recent court decision in St. Petersburg demonstrates the elastic nature of codifying the historical record on legal grounds. Given monumentalization in Soviet and Russian cultural mythology, and Putin's insistence that, quote, the Nazis were defeated first and foremost by the Soviet people, underlines Russian authorities' symbolic commitment to preventing any possibility of repeating what happened in Leningrad, while also opposing legitimate criticism of Russian historical revisionism as, quote, attempts to falsify history, however ironic or contradictory. The politicization of the siege in Russian state memory, a product of the civil religion devoted to the Great Patriotic War, as it is known, may also be viewed as a response to the growing international interest in defining, recognizing, and preventing acts of genocide. However, Russia's inherited hesitation toward Holocaust memory distinguishes ethnicized suffering as second to the dominant heroic narrative, thus challenging the ways in which Russians identify with genocide, as well as how genocide's moral imperatives are manipulated to sustain public approval. And as such, the court's decision raises important questions on the use of genocide as a currency whose value is vital to understanding genocide memory in Russia today. Thank you.